my belief about shame. Shame are the lies I believe about myself and the lies I believe about God. And the way that we respond to shame, shame is healed, or we shed our shame when we experience truth in the context of community. So I think that's that's part of the power. I think that's why there is an emotional reaction when we're held hostage by the lies of shame, when we're in that bondage and someone speaks truth to us. There is this freedom that comes with that. And, sometimes truth has consequences. Sometimes truth is painful, and even painful truth still creates freedom. I think that living in the truth, I betrayed my wife and I am God's good creation. Both of those things can be true.
Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. We are back again today with our host, Dr. Greg Miller, as usual.
I'm good.
Good. By the way, I'm Randy Everett, the co-host. And again, we're happy to have Deb Laaser with us today. Deb is the director here at Faithful and True. And on our last podcast, we got really involved into a hot topic about depersonalization.
Right. And we're going to continue the conversation. And so if you're just joining us, we want to talk about this idea of personalizing means that I make something all about me. And so I interpret it through this filter of who I am and what I believe about myself. And I become kind of the center of the universe and how I experience life. And so this is kind of an invitation to expand beyond that, to see that things that happen in our life, choices that people make, are not necessarily about who we are or what we've done or our strengths or our limitations. And so we're going to continue the conversation. And last time we talked a lot about the importance of wives who are able to depersonalize their husband's addiction and choices and the betrayal. And we also clarified what we mean by that is understanding that the motivation for my husband's choices of betrayal or the addiction or the sexual acting out is not about me. It's not about me being enough or about my self-worth. It really is about the power of the addiction. So the motivation is not about me, and yet the impact is directly about me and the consequences that I've experienced.
Yeah. The ampersand, as we talk about so much around here, becomes very important to understand the truth. That just because you didn't cause it and can't cure it or control it doesn't mean that you're not impacted by it. And we fully know that that's a truth, and we need to take time for that grieving process and all the emotions that go with that, because it's a huge loss in life. And so we certainly do that in our counseling here.
Absolutely.
Can you remind our listeners just what we mean by the ampersand
principle? Oh, sure. When we talk about the ampersand theology here is kind of what we say. What we mean is that truth is often very complicated. And whereas we often get into a black and white response to something, the truth might be better said with a both and in the statement. So it might be true that I know today that I didn't cause my husband's acting out, and that it wasn't because I wasn't enough. And it's also true I'm devastated, and I'm going to need a ton of support in order to heal from this.
Right.
That can be true too.
Down the road, I think one of them can be my husband can love me, and in his choices, he betrays me. And that may take some time to understand that those two things can be together.
Coexist.
But we also see that for couples that are able to live in that space, we often say that if we live in an either or world, you're either in or out, you're either good or bad, you're either right or wrong, that the truth cannot fit in that limited space, that we need the andness to create the bigness of space for all of the truth. And if it's not all of the truth, then it's not the truth. We need the fullness of the truth.
Yeah.
One thing that we would say, just like we were talking about the wives not personalizing their husband's actions, it's also important that the husband understand that he is not defined by these choices, that the choices are significant, that when you betray someone, that is an important thing to understand, and yet that's not who he is. I often say that our value, our identity, and our safety come from who God is and who God created us to be. And it's not changed by whatever choice I made. So if I make a good choice, that suddenly doesn't make me good. If I make a bad choice, that suddenly doesn't make me bad. That the identity, who I am, it comes from God's creation of me. And so that's part of what we want men to understand, is because many of them come to our workshop and they are just consumed by shame. And they have these messages about themselves that they are worthless, that they are disgusting, that they are a pervert, that this is who they are and that's why they did these things. And so just like we talked about in the last podcast, that wives can benefit from some education about addiction, we absolutely know that men need that education too, because it gives them a new context or lens through which to see their choices. It doesn't in any way minimize their responsibility or the significance of their choices. It helps them to understand them.
And that ampersand is so important. You know, you are a good man and you did some things that were incredibly painful to yourself and to your relationships, to your wife, kids. And I think when we hear truth, when it often comes through the both and statement, most people just really start reacting emotionally to that, I find. Because so often, again, people want to make it an either or. You're a horrible person. You've always been a horrible person, evidently, even though I didn't know about it. And so everything's been a waste in our life. And that's not really a truth.
Right. Well, and it's
opinion.
the idea of either you loved me or you betrayed me. And if those are my two options, well, I know that you betrayed me, therefore you must not love me.
Exactly.
And I do think that, in the last podcast, I talked about this idea of my belief about shame. Shame are the lies I believe about myself and the lies I believe about God. And the way that we respond to shame is healed, or we shed our shame when we experience truth in the context of community. So I think that's that's part of the power. I think that's why there is an emotional reaction when we're held hostage by the lies of shame, when we're in that bondage and someone speaks truth to us. There is this freedom that comes with that. And, sometimes truth has consequences. Sometimes truth is painful, and even painful truth still creates freedom. And I think that living in the truth, I betrayed my wife and I am God's good creation. Both of those things can be true.
I don't know. I find working with wives that it's helpful to be able to rephrase our beliefs oftentimes with this generosity of the ampersand, because most of them come from a place of, I love my husband. I've obviously married him, and I wouldn't have done that if there weren't so many things that I didn't love about him. And now I'm facing all this other information that's not consistent with that. But to be able to put that in an ampersand statement, and I do love him, and I hate the fact that he's done these behaviors, makes a lot of sense and almost gives them some relief that they can live with both of those truths about their belief system.
I would also say, we kind of talked about this last time, when you get this new information, it can feel as if I did not know my husband. It's like either I fully know my husband or I didn't know my husband, and that either or creates all kinds of chaos. So this idea that there were things I did know about my husband, and there are ways I've experienced him that have been real, authentic, and genuine, and there have been secrets and hiding and deception. Again, both of those things can be true. And what's also true is that's what creates the complexity, that I have to make decisions based upon the complexity of truth. And many times we gravitate towards the either or because it appears to be safer. If my husband is either a good man or a betrayer, if my husband either loves me or betrays me, well, if he betrayed me, then that's the easy answer. I don't have to deal with this other thing. In fact, early on in our recovery, Beth went to one of the appointments. She was invited to come to an appointment that I was having with my therapist at the time. And one of the things that the therapist said to her was, this would be so much easier. And I'm going to use a different term than the therapist used. But what the gist is, this would be so much easier if Greg was a jerk. And I think what he was saying was that if I wasn't engaging recovery, if I hadn't at times been a good husband and a good dad, if at times Beth and I hadn't had significant connection and a good history, this would be an easy decision to make, because if Greg had always been a jerk and this is just evidence of his jerkness, then yes, it makes sense to leave. There's a complexity in the Greg did a very jerky thing. And again, that's not the term he used. Greg did a jerky thing and Greg is a good man. That's where the complexity is.
I just used that example today with the wife I'm working with. And that's exactly the case. Her husband's doing great work. And it's like, how can I be angry and sad and, whatever, when I look over there and see what a changed person he is? And when I said, yeah, it'd be easier if he were a jerk, wouldn't it? And she said, yes, it sure would be. And so, trying to put things into black and white is one of the reasons that I think we end up with a lot of beliefs, core beliefs, that are not truthful. And I don't know about you, Greg, but the majority of people I work with live in a very black and white world before we begin our work together.
Right.
Would
Well,
you
and
find
again, I would say that's true. And I think that comes from a couple of things. One is, again, safety is found in the either or. You're either for me or against me. Well, if you're against me, then I'm not going to be with you. And I just want those people who are for me. I'm either right or wrong. And so when the more complex life gets, the more we want to simplify it through living in the extremes, the either or. I think there's another piece to it, and that's also many of us grew up in churches that taught us about this either or kind of world. You're either good or bad, you're either in or out, you're either right or wrong. And so there's a sense of righteousness that comes along with that. And it's true that there is an andness to who God is and the way that God created the world. And many times we miss out on that. Even Jesus is seen in his andness, fully divine and fully human. There's something that we take into that we wrestle with things that are complex when we embrace all of the andness that is out there. We see David. David was a man after God's own heart and was a betrayer and contributed to the murder of somebody. We know that Paul was seen as the leading founder of the church and a significant movement there. And he wrestled with things. And what's interesting is whatever he wrestled with, he had so much shame about, he could not name out loud. And so in the way that we see the people of the scripture, we see their andness. And so I think it's challenging sometimes if you grew up in an environment where it was either right or wrong, in or out. This can almost feel like you're betraying your faith. I've even had somebody say, it feels like I'm watering down my faith to live in the andness. And again, what I would say is truth is complex, and we cannot live in the fullness of the truth if we're not willing to live in the andness of the truth.
Would it be okay to shift to maybe how we start personalizing things in our coupleships?
Absolutely.
And I do think this goes on from when we first meet and start creating our relationship, because again, it's so easy to create beliefs about ourselves based on what another person is doing or saying. And most of us don't have the skills to know how to check it out or to think about other possibilities and to be a possibilitarian. And so we go away believing things about ourselves. I'll bring up an example of when Mark and I were first married. And the example is that I had always lived in a family where I was fairly sure, a lot of times I wouldn't have known when my parents went to bed. But what I did know from them talking and then watching as I got older is they always went to bed at the same time. And I guess I just assumed that's what couples do. And it seemed like a nice intimate thing to do, whether you like to read or do something else when you go to bed at the same time. But my expectation when I got married is that we would as well. And to my surprise, Mark was never tired when I was ready to go to bed. And so he would most often stay up and watch TV or, as I learned later, do something else. And so I quickly made a message about that, a belief about myself that there must be something wrong with me, which is why he doesn't want to come to bed with me. And what was hurtful, and I carried that for a long time, is I never talked about it. I didn't go to him and check it out. I didn't think of other possibilities. I just lived with that belief about myself, which created a lot of pain for me. And we started talking about it when we got into recovery for his sex addiction. That was a nice thing to talk about because I finally learned the truth about that.
Right.
You know?
Well, and what we're talking about here is couple shame. And when couples come to the workshop, one of the things that we want to acknowledge is just like we have individual shame and we have these core beliefs that are negative about ourselves, we can also have that about who we are as a couple. And kind of the way it shows up is the belief that we are the worst couple or our marriage is the worst or the weakest, whatever language we would use. Or we have the worst story can be another way our shame shows up. And so to recognize that there can be complexity in our relationship, there can be hurt in our relationship, and in our relationship, it is our story, and there can be hope in that also. And again, it's the andness. There are some things as a couple we do well. We maybe parent well together. Maybe we do some of those administrative tasks well together. Maybe we have fun together, and we do that well. And there is this pain that is a part of our relationship that also needs to be addressed. And so that andness piece, I think, becomes very important when we're looking at who we are as a couple.
Well, there are just so many patterns in all of our relationships that give us the opportunity, if we're not careful, to personalize something in a negative way for ourselves. And so whether it's, my husband isn't talking to me enough, even though he's in recovery, he's talking to everybody else, he's not talking to me, so that must mean our marriage isn't doing very well, or I'm not a safe enough person for him, or whatever. Those negative beliefs, again, will keep showing up until we work at being safe enough with each other to check it out, first of all, and also to think about and present some other possibilities about why they might be doing what they're doing.
Right. Well, and an example from my relationship is it took me a while to realize this, but one of my shame messages, one of my negative core beliefs was I'm not lovable. And so Beth would try to love me. She would express that towards me, but because I didn't believe it was possible, I wasn't able to receive it. And so, I might look at our coupleship and what's true is I would blame Beth. If Beth would just do this, then I would feel loved. And the beauty of recovery is it helped me dig a little bit deeper to go, oh, actually, this isn't about Beth. It's about how I'm able to receive the love that she is giving me. And that doesn't mean that Beth was perfect in that, but I was setting Beth up to fail by expecting her to do something that she couldn't do. She could not rescue me from this core belief. And so sometimes when a couple looks at the things that aren't working in their marriage, it's because maybe they're blaming their spouse for something that they're needing or wanting to be different, but it really has something to do about their own shame messages or the way that they perceive themselves. I often say one of the best gifts that we can give our spouse is the courage to live in the truth and to move towards the healing that we need and stop blaming them for things that are not their responsibility.
So ways we cope in our relationship definitely give our spouse the opportunity to create a negative belief about themselves too. And I know one of my major ways of coping was withdrawing and just being quiet. And, that seems like a quiet, non-important thing to stop doing. And yet it created a lot of pain for a lot of people because they didn't know what I was thinking or needing at that time.
A non-aggressive approach.
Exactly. And what I know today is, if I were quiet or not talking about something, it would surely leave Mark to believe that, he wasn't important to me. He wasn't chosen by me. I didn't care about him. And it's understandable that he might go to those places. So he isn't here today, obviously. But if I were to go to a place where I needed space and I needed to go somewhere alone and take some time alone, which I might if there's something I'm working on, I could easily, again, kind of offer that information to another person or to Mark if he were here. Just like, I'm going to be away, or I'm not going to be talking for a while because I'm just entering a time of silence over something I'm working on. And it's not about not loving you and not wanting to choose you. So again, we tell them about what it's not about so that they don't go to that automatic negative belief about themselves. And that can be very helpful.
Well, I think, again, we learn these coping strategies from our life growing up. We bring them into our relationship. And so in that particular case where you're offering information and you're making it clear, I am choosing to do this. You're not responsible for it. And I am doing it because maybe you've done something that was hurtful or I've been triggered into something. And that doesn't change the fact that I love you and I choose you. And I think that's where it gets so complicated is when we start making meanings and messages out of our spouse's choices or behaviors and we kind of globalize something. And so, we have a lot of the, if you loved me, you wouldn't do this. Or, love means this. And so if our spouse is doing something outside of that context, we can easily go to, well, you must not love me or you must not choose me. We often talk at the couples workshop, there could be an old core belief that if you loved me, you would know my needs. I wouldn't have to offer them. I wouldn't have to tell them. You would just intuitively know them. And so if you don't know my needs, I draw the conclusion that, oh, you must not love me. And so the more we can separate that out, you can love me and you don't know my needs unless I express them. You can love me and at times you can withdraw from me because maybe that's something you do to create safety. You can love me and at times you can be angry with me. It's allowing the and-ness to even expand our understanding of what love looks like, or like you were saying, what a marriage looks like and what a relationship is supposed to be.
Yeah. Well, I want to take this even further to outside our marriages, to the community we live in. And because what we're trying to say here is as we learn to depersonalize things that are happening, because things are happening all the time. Some of them are very nice things, some of them not so nice. One of them for me yesterday was I went to a doctor's appointment, and when the doctor came in, eye doctor this was, he's usually very, social. We talk about some things, whatever, and he walked in and he was just totally quiet, and usually he shakes my hand, so I put my hand out, and he goes, oh, well, I've too much stuff in my hand, I got to put it down, and he was just kind of irritable, and he didn't answer my questions very well. He just kind of wasn't his normal self, and my old self might have gone to this core belief like, I think he's irritated with me as a patient. I probably ought to find somebody else to go to. But instead, I went to that place of possibility, and I thought, what else? I wonder if he and his wife had a bad morning together.
Yeah.
I wonder if he's just got way too many patients scheduled on his week this week. I wonder if he needs a vacation. He hasn't taken it yet. And by the time I left, it was like a non-issue.
Right.
It's like he clearly is, something's going on. It isn't necessarily about me. I'm going to go and have a nice cup of coffee now that I'm done with this appointment and get on with my day.
Right.
So there were like no negative energy beliefs that I carried out of there. But, historically, I could have gone to that place, I think, and made it about me.
And kind of like what we talked about in the last podcast, if it had been more of a personal relationship, this is your eye doctor, if it was a more personal relationship, you could say, hey, it seems like you're having a bad day, or just want to check that out. How's that going with you?
Yeah.
In the last podcast, we talked about depersonalizing parenting. And I think this is one of those places that it makes a lot of sense. If we have that old message, if my children love me, then they would do this. They would always obey me. And then what I do is I interpret their disobedience as some sort of expression that they don't love me. Well, children can love me. My children can love me and not obey me. They can be finding their voice. They can be differentiating themselves. They can just be in a bad place and be rebellious. I don't have to make it about myself. And so the more that we are able to separate that out, and again, what is mine, I need to take responsibility for, but so much of this isn't mine and I can release that. And I think that's kind of what we're wanting to encourage people to do in their marriages, in their recovery, as they think of themselves and other relationships. Whatever is mine, I'm going to take responsibility for. But what's not mine and what's not about me, I'm going to release. And kind of the invitation here is to really dig in to see what are those shame messages that I bring into these relationships that actually are keeping me from living in the truth of who I am, the truth of my situations, the truth of who God is, and the truth of who my spouse is.
One time, I keep bringing up examples. I guess I have a lot of them of how I personalize things in my life. I'm very grateful for recovery and being able to change that around.
Absolutely.
But I remember talking to my therapist. She was so gifted about something that was going on that I didn't do well with one of the kids. And I remember just feeling a lot of shame about that. And of course, I put out my negative core belief about, I'm just not a very good mom. And she knew me well, but she looked at me and she goes, Debbie, there's something about you believing that is rather narcissistic, don't you think? Like, you're not the only one that impacts your children, And it was just kind of like, oh, well, that's a nice thing to hear because
Absolutely.
you're right. There are a lot of things that are influencing their behaviors and how they
dare I
act.
think like that?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
But it was just such a different perspective in terms of looking at this personalizing stuff that in some ways, maybe it's a little bit narcissistic to think it is all about me.
Right. Well, I when you were sharing that, I thought of the conversation that Mark had with Maureen about when he first told his story, the way that she responded to say, you must have been in a lot of pain to do what you did.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a beautiful example of what it means to depersonalize it. Yeah. So instead of it being about, I'm a horrible man, I'm disgusting, I'm filthy, it's, oh, I'm responsible for what I did. And what caused me to do it was not that I'm this horrible man, I was trying to medicate pain. Yeah. And there's an invitation in that. Well, if it's about pain, then it's about moving towards that pain and healing that pain. That's where I'm going to find my freedom.
Yeah. Well, personalizing, it's an interesting topic and one we just invite you to think about in your own life. What I know is true for me is I get better and better at not doing that everywhere I go. I have a lot more joy in my life. Mm-hmm. And I think that's our hope for all of you.
That is our hope for everyone, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so just one more clarification. Just because we're saying don't personalize it doesn't mean it doesn't impact you personally.
Oh, that's true.
So we just want to be clear. This is one of those topics that we talked about are complex. So we're not minimizing what a husband does. We're not dismissing what a husband does. We're helping to understand that the motivation isn't because of a person or who a person is, and the choices directly impact the people in his life. Mm-hmm. So we just want to make sure that that message gets out there one more time.
Thank you.
Thank you for the clarity, Greg. This is why we keep him around.
Yeah.
He comes up with these gems. We'd like to thank you all for joining us today on the Faithful and True podcast. We'd like to thank Debbie for being with us. Back-to-back podcasts.
Yes,
great stuff as always. We appreciate you greatly. And Greg as well.
Good to be here.
All right. We'd also like to thank our producer for the last couple of podcasts, Kayla. Yes, we're going to turn the camera around and show everybody you now, and you can take a bow. We greatly appreciate you and Aaron, who helps us out on a regular basis as well. If you have discovered in listening to any of our podcasts that you have an issue with unwanted sexual behavior, compulsive sexual behavior, and are looking for the help that's available for you here at Faithful and True, we invite you to visit our website, faithfulandtrue.com, where you'll find many resources, many podcasts, our online bookstore, as well as online information and online registration for our 3-day intensive workshops. We have one starting tomorrow, and we have the exciting news to share that it's full. So tomorrow will not be the one for you. So take a look, because we offer it every month, and April still has some availability in it as well. So until we join you again soon, thank you very much. We hope that the coming week is filled with many blessings and with great vision.